and I shall never understand it. Maybe the times had changed, but that was how it was.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
So we will break for. We will meet again in about 20 minutes at 3:45. See you then.
Is that working?
Yes. Direct. TDA. Okay. We'll start. And so the first speaker now is Martin Harrison, and who is the author of several books, notably on photography and magazine culture since World War II. And the last one which I've seen is a book called Young Meteors on British journalism, and that's actually included in the book photographers like Nigel Henderson and also others such as Roger Main. And he is currently curating a major show at the Barbican Art Gallery on the art scene in the 1950s, which opens in January 2002, so very soon, in other words. And he recently gave a lecture on the connection between Nigel Henderson and Brutalism. So in other words, I think his knowledge of the scene in the 1950s is very broad. And he said to me on the telephone that he would speak today on something relating to image. So he also said to me that he tends to work things as he goes, partly. And I also said two words about Peter Smithson. So, I mean, most of you will know who he is, so I'll be very brief, but that he will arrive, I believe, in 5 minutes. And Peter studied at architecture at Newcastle. He's been the main exponent, really, together with Alison Smithson, of the new Brutalism, coined perhaps by Irne Scalbert, but also partly by them. And he has, of course, collaborated, as you know already, those who have attended the lecture which he gave on Patio and Pavilion, I think about 3 weeks ago or so, so he has collaborated together with Nigel Henderson and Eduardo Paolozzi in the 1950s. He is, of course, a founder member of Tim 10, and his best-known building is most probably the Economist building down in St. James, 1964, which is still standing. And afterwards, I think we'll have a discussion. We'll go straight into the discussion, and which will be chaired by Peter Beard, who is a unit master here at the AA in the Diploma School. And last, also at 6 o'clock, Lars Müller will actually launch the publication as found, the English version, and I understand the suitcase has arrived with books inside. And also Lars Müller has kindly agreed to give a short presentation at the book launch, which is called, I think, Building Books. And he is a publisher, and I should also say that he is a joint sponsor of this conference. But to begin with, so Martin Harrison.
I made this talk in 3 parts, and we'll never get as far as the third, which is the bit you've been promised on the idea of image. It's based on a talk that I gave a couple of weeks ago, as Mr. Scalbert said, about Nigel Henderson and trying to relate him to brutalism. And he seemed to want me to talk more about his relationship to photography, and I do, or at least I begin like that, but I insist in saying a couple of things about brutalism, because that really has a lot to do with the way in which I see what Nigel Henderson's and the Independent's contribution really was in the 50s. So it's essential in a way to talk about that. So I'll come to that in, as it were, the second part. Hopefully we'll get that far. But but I'll crack on, else we'll never get anywhere. Addressing the theme of the day, this is as... Okay. This is really addresses several issues. There are photographs or photograms by Nigel Henderson, reproduced in ARC magazine, the journal of the students at the Royal College of Art, in 1956. That is, in a sense, already after the independent group had finished as a group. But these two subjects, in a way, I think, address most closely the idea of as found, and I think, in fact, in the magazine's caption somewhere, source material at the bottom there, a found lantern slide. Those of you who've seen Vicky Walsh's book on Nigel Henderson will be familiar from the reproduction of quite a lot of these images, which is Nigel literally finding by chance some old lantern slides, not taken by himself, and seeing what he could do with them. In a way that also illustrates for me something about him which I think is essential to understand in relation to what I'm going to say about his photography and the way in which that fits into the context of 1950s photography. And I mean, like almost anything that one says at these things, it's a sort of oversimplification, but not far off. And that is that essentially he seemed to me to be atavistic in the sense that he was even nostalgic in that the things that he was retrieving or working with or retranslating tended to have to do with the past in some way. That may be to do a lot with his own psychology, his own life, which we can't really get into in depth now. But what it wasn't to do with, and I think what's often mistaken in assessments of the independent group, is anything to do with pop. And I'll come back to pop later. Also, I think I'm really looking at ways in which Nigel Henderson can be said to have contributed to either photography or even other things in a direct and discernible way. And one of his important functions, I think, especially for the independent group, he was slightly older than all of the members of the independent group and had pre-war experience. And the war, I mean, listening to Alan Solito just then, I mean, the war just is invoked the whole time. It's this great sort of chasm of the 1940s, a sort of hiatus, a stop point. And Nigel is one of the key figures, I think, who was involved before the war, both in surrealism, through his mother, in book illustration, in a very avant-garde way. Actually, let's digress already. Here's one I've made up. Alan Solito, I was interested, I didn't know this, that he had been on Mallorca and knew Robert Graves there. And Len Lai, the experimental filmmaker, collagist, collager of book illustrations who worked for a press largely run by Nigel Henderson's mother, he hooked up with Robert Graves and did one of his great book covers pre-war, which Nigel Henderson testified to his admiration for. So there's a strange sort of Robert Graves influence there, who picked up this sort of itinerant New Zealander who's living in Hammersmith, where Laura Riding and Robert Graves lived before the war. So I like the circularity of the fact that Alan Solito, he seemed to play a part in assessing the work that he was doing there in Mallorca in the 50s as an emerging writer. Well, Nigel similarly goes across this trajectory of the war, and he brought in a lot of his contacts. He knew many people, I mean key people like Duchamp, many surrealists, Dadaists, British surrealists like Julian Trevelyan, Jennings, Len Lai, who I mentioned. He knew these people before the war, and in a sense that the 1940s changed everything, but he had those contacts or direct experience of those people after the war, and I think he transmitted that and in fact facilitated the work that a lot of his independent group colleagues went on to do in the 50s by virtue of those contacts and his intimate knowledge of those movements. And this is a slide, I mean, it's never been seen before, it might be one reason to show it. It's photographed by Nigel Henderson, actually done for Vogue magazine in 1951, and it was commissioned by Vogue. When he was kind of rediscovered in the 1970s, he spoke of his sort of tentative stepping in the waters of being a commercial photographer. I'm sure you probably all know he worked for Architectural Review on a few occasions, but he never really was a commercial photographer. He was kind of private in his activities, and indeed there wasn't that much dissemination of his work, which is another thing I'll talk about. however, this was interesting to me because it was fortuitous, but this is Cecil Collins, the photograph of Cecil Collins, a kind of visionary, neo-romantic painter who himself was established before the war, but here was photographed after the war by Nigel. And I found it interesting, actually, that on a commissioned portrait for Vogue, I don't know whether this is a sort of épate le bourgeois streak in him or what, but he deliberately had to make it grungy, it seems. I'm not really comfortable with this working for a slick, professional, glossy fashion magazine. I'm going to put a rotten old boot in this picture. That'll show him. And in a way, it's no surprise they never used him again, maybe. I mean, he wasn't going to play, I mean, all credit to him, but he wasn't going to play by their rules. But he was kind of anti-slick. And in a way, the boot is kind of found material. I'm sure he didn't take it along thinking here's an ideal prop. It looks to be some kind of semi-bomb site. This is photographed in a destroyed factory or something. And I know that they picked up this old boot on the site, which appealed to him. So in a sense, it's also the as found again. Even Nigel's emergence as a photographer was A, sort of fortuitous, and B, takes us across this trajectory of the war again, because in 1945, his wife, Judith Henderson, who was an anthropologist, was required to move to Bethnal Green. Now, both came from pretty solid upper middle class backgrounds, and they hadn't really seen people like the working class communities that lived in this area of Bethnal Green after the war, but it was a requirement of the job, which was really observing working class communities, but they had to live in the district. That was one of the rules, so they found themselves moving immediately after the end of the war to Chisenhall Road, and that's not actually a plaque on the house, well, it's just a number plate, but the one that looks like it is, that was Nigel and Judith's house on Chisenhall Road. Now rather pleasant and yuppified, but if you're familiar with his photographs of that district, very much run down and war-scarred when they lived there, and really rather different in aspect. But Judith's anthropological study, and they lived here for 9 years, and her anthropological study, of course, is again a sort of continuance of the pre-war mass observation idea from the 1930s. So the activity she was involved in, which took them to this area, was itself a sort of continuance of something that had begun before the war. I think it was quite unusual, really, at that date, and indeed none of her work was ever published, and one often thinks, though she did many, many years of minute observation of particularly one neighbouring family with whom they became quite close. One often wonders almost what the point was, but Nigel himself had been profoundly affected by the war and was in a pretty bad shape mentally, and he, in his own words, spent 3 years just walking about the streets of this area, which were fascinating to him, and it never occurred to him to, for example, take photographs of it, and he didn't own a camera. Then in 1948 he was given a Leica camera, or loaned a Leica camera, having got the idea, well, maybe after 3 years and coming to terms with this kind of theatre of the streets, as he saw it almost going on in this community, that it was almost a logical step, let's take photographs. Plus, he was studying at the Slade School of Art, which is how he got to meet Paolozzi, William Turnbull, and just slightly later Richard Hamilton. That's how that connection was made. However, during the 3 or so years he was studying at the Slade, he says that he never completed one painting. So in a sense, I mean, put it as crude as, he was a failed artist. And so if he wanted to make images, the camera suddenly, especially with his growing fascination with where he lived, seemed to present a very interesting way of doing it. Now, I think there are fundamental differences, however, between, Mr. Scalbert raised this question of street photography and connections with other things discussed today, and the whole idea of street photography is now recognized almost as this kind of important subgenre of photography itself. It's something most associated with American photography and New York, and indeed in the 1950s, which is really the decade that we're looking at, it's debatable to what extent there really was such a thing as street photography in this country. How there was a slight sort of possibility of it, or murmurings of it, and Nigel take parts in that as a kind of originator, I guess. But it was not in any sense really to be related to, and I think there are many fundamental differences between American street photography as it's widely understood. This is a photograph from 1952, very much that Nigel independent group period, done in London, as you can probably guess, but by Robert Frank. Swiss-born, of course, but the most famous of American street photographers for a period in the 50s when he did that before taking up movies. And he stands, in a sense, very much at the beginning of a tradition of American street photography with his contemporaries such as Louis Forer, William Klein, Saul Leiter, and then going on through later generations, Lee Friedlander, Gary Winogrand, and still many people in America working in that tradition. There was really nothing quite like that in America. The sort of adjectives used to describe it. First of all, as those who know about photography can probably guess from this image, it's taken on a 35mm camera. They're usually Leicas. It's that kind of shooting of that immediacy of action caught, which is slightly different than Cartier-Bresson and often called from the hip. And it's an idea of getting to a sort of, it's urban almost always, a sort of urgency and immediacy. And that really was very different to the British equivalent. So that John Sarkowski, head of photography at the Museum of Modern Art until not that long ago, and one of the great gurus really of American photography, could say without too much challenge, in a sense, that in the 1950s, photography in Britain was a black hole. I mean, he meant in general, but it certainly would have applied to this area of it. But there is a kind of tenuous thread, which begins here. I mean, these are observable facts, but one wouldn't want to make too much of it, in a sense, or at least make too close a comparison with what's generally called street photography. This is just something I copied out of my book, but I'd put this here for I mean, I'm sure no one bothers reading rubbish that I write, but it's kind of an important point here, I think, because this was Roger Main, who was a young photographer who had become aware of Nigel's work, which, and I can't emphasize this too strongly, almost no one was. There was almost no publication of Nigel Henderson's photography in the 1950s. It was almost impossible to know it outside of the independent group and a few close friends and colleagues. There was no dissemination of it. He happened to know it because Nigel had sent a few things off to a body called the Combined Societies, who arranged sort of early amateur photography exhibitions traveling around Britain. And Roger, as a very young man, just out of Oxford, was helping Hugo van Wadenoijen organize those exhibitions. And he'd seen a couple of Henderson's pictures submitted to this exhibition society and thought, wow, he looks interesting. And he actually made the pilgrimage to Bethnal Green to meet this very interesting photographer. And he made several others, and while doing so, he took some photographs, and you can read the caption, this is the Henderson's kitchen, of their kitchen. However, it's neither 35mm, it's square, and it's not a street photograph. So again, this tenuous thread of street photography is a tenuous one. However, the link is there, and in a way this is a passing of ideas across generations, which Roger was part of. And you could extend this thing through the 60s and out into the next decade. And this is really closely parallels what Alan Sillitoe was talking about in so many ways. I was so interested in what he was saying, in that Don McCullin, as a young guy, really basically untrained, just out of the RAF, with a keen interest in photography, but no idea how you could make a career, in the late 50s, had seen reproduced some of Roger Main's photographs, and was a great admirer, and he seemed among British photographers the only one who would offer real inspiration. And this is a very early Don McCullin job from the long-defunct Sunday Graphic magazine in 1960. So there is a real, if very slim thread there through from Nigel Henderson, through Roger Main, and onto Don McCullin. But really, Nigel's photographs were not street photographs in the sense, even that rather atypical English photograph of Robert Franks, in many ways, they were generally quite theatrical. They were often people looking at the camera, playing up for the camera as they were here. Now, that's not always true, of course. Apart from a few very early photographs, they were not taken on 35mm, but he really wasn't trying to capture any sort of decisive moment in the Cartier-Bresson way, or any real urban urgency and immediacy in the American way. Often, of course, they are inanimate objects, the things that Nigel photographed. We started with the exploded milk bottle, for example. But even the street photographs were really rather about something different. I think what Nigel did, which was full of potential, but it's a potential that really wasn't taken up in this country, as far as I can see, by anyone. And this again relates very much to the as found was. He saw very, very clearly, and Nigel was a great writer. This was brought out in the day at Sudbury, and it cannot be overemphasized. He was a wonderful writer, and he himself wrote very, very clearly in a way that really deserves more examination. His idea that for him the camera took negatives, and these negatives were almost the beginning of the process. They were the basis for many possible explorations of what could take place after that negative. It's a bit like, but not completely like by any means, what I always thought was one of the most pretentious things ever said about photography by the famous American landscape photographer Ansel Adams, who hokey photographers love musical analogies, and he always used to say the negative is the score, the print is the performance. And really this was a way of justifying this fine printing in this ultra meticulous American way, which is so foreign to Nigel's aesthetic, who was not really a slick technician at all. In a way, if you're going to pursue that analogy, for Nigel Henderson, perhaps John Cage would be more the musical analogy in terms of the infinite possibilities and variations from a very open score. And this open score of his negative was something, so the process for him almost started in the dark room then, where from a negative, his raw material, he could do anything he wanted. He could fold it, he could reverse it tonally, he could blow it up large, he could muck around with it, he could lay things on the negative plane that he picked up on the street. It was that idea of infinite variation that's possible from a negative, which I think was the exciting area of potential in Nigel's work. But really, although he taught a class in creative photography at the Central School, just over there, for 3 years in the early 1950s, I've never seen much evidence that anyone in photography picked up on that. I mean, this was, of course, before the regularization of photography studies and any particular great interest in the medium. This is a slide I again showed at Sudbury, but I don't know how familiar it is. I think it's been reproduced now in one of the independent group pieces of literature. But in a way, the contrast between that last photograph with the children looking at Nigel, conscious of being photographed, this in a sense emphasizes the difference, I wouldn't want to make too much of this, between most of his photographs, even of the East End and the people on the streets. This is a Cartier-Bresson photograph done for the English magazine Illustrated in the East End in 1951, exactly the same time. And in fact, Nigel took Cartier-Bresson around, and the story goes that he deliberately withheld some of his favorite shooting locations and just took Cartier-Bresson to more easily known ones like Petticoat Lane, which he would have got to anyway, but kept some of his own favorite spots to himself. But I think even this, the idea is that this is the Cartier-Bresson decisive moment. He's the unseen witness to something which was going on, where clearly in the last photograph by Nigel that was not the case. Again, just to take this idea back over the war, I think a lot of even at the end of Alan Silito's talk, I was kind of willing him to say this, and he did in the end, about the way he wrote that text. He called it automatic. And that idea of automatism as a part of surrealism, I think, is a really key thing with the independent group, with Nigel Henderson. And I thought it was very interesting because there are already so many links between that and the emergence of Alan Silito as a writer. He did actually say, oh, it sort of wrote itself, it was automatic. So there, again, we're going back to pre-war surrealism, which so much of what Nigel Henderson, Paolozzi, and the others were involved with related to. So again, in that context, this is just a photograph by Morinage from the 1936 book Street Markets of London, just a pre-war reference which must almost certainly have been well known to Nigel. Well, I mentioned that there was this kind of thread along through Nigel into Roger Main, and Roger Main himself had photographs reproduced in ARC, again the Royal College of Art student magazine, here a little later on in the 1950s. He became himself, he had his own favourite area of London in North Kensington, not the East End, and perhaps was most well known at that time for those photographs, most extensively printed in Theo Crosby's magazine Uppercase, of course largely an architectural magazine, in 1961. And in a sense you could have a whole talk about the connections between Roger Main and architecture, and indeed architectural photography. So we won't. Incidentally, this has nevertheless more of a relationship to me with Nigel Henderson than it does with, say, Cartier-Bresson or Robert Frank, any of the continental or American photographers. All of these people are very conscious of his camera. They're also all not photographed on a Leica or 35mm camera. They're on a roll film camera. So there are certain formal connections, again, which are maintained more with an English, if you like, and Nigel Henderson tradition than with any European or American one. Mr. Scalbert asked me to kind of link in just about everything said today, so I made some kind of effort in that Roger Main took the photograph for this book, one of the key novels, if you like, of the late 1950s, written, as you can see, by Colin McInnes and made into a lousy film some years ago. Photographed in North Kensington on Roger Main's favourite patch in London, but very much a set-up picture and not the sort of thing he did. Although he had people relating to his camera, this was set up using models, in fact, a young couple known to Colin McInnes. However, I mean, it's got a relevance on several levels. McInnes had already written up a review of Roger Main's first important one-man exhibition, which was at the ICA in 1956, so on Nigel Henderson's territory, as it were. So for many, he really spoke very warmly of this young photographer with his pioneer exhibition. So he's a very logical choice for a novel that was really set in the same area of London that Roger actually photographed in. So in a sense, there's a direct connection there with a locality. And I mean, Alan Salito, I think, said it all for me in a way. I heard the whole of his talk, luckily. And he didn't relate himself, I think, to the emergence of the angry young men. But again, this becomes circular with things that, like Rainer Banham claiming about the origins of brutalism and raising analogies. In fact, he was almost saying that the architects of brutalism were angry young men before it was a phrase used about the writers, Amos Larkin and so on, or John Osborne. And just, coming a few years later, Salito fits into that same context. It also relates, of course, to social realism in painting, and realism, though a dangerous word, could crop up in any of these contexts that I'm talking about. Also, I was interested, because I'd forgotten, to be honest, but those two films, the famous film Saturday Night and Long Distance Runner, were directed by Carol Rice and Tony Richardson, of course. And I'd also been asked to say something about free cinema in this context, which is pretty tricky, but that was another semi-documentary tradition that you could raise parallels perhaps more with Nigel, in that certainly Carol Rice insists now that this was not just documentary filmmaking. It was of course influenced partly by Italian neo-realism, but it wasn't just that. And they always reserved the right to editorialize in those films. There was something else. There was, if you like, a poetic element as well as the pure recording, the pure realist, pure documentation. And the only connection I could come up with all of that was then he mentioned his name again in the context that one of the main most important cameramen for both the free cinema movies of the mid-50s and then the big commercial movies like Saturday Night and Long Distance Runner was Walter Lasserly. And Walter Lasserly shot extra footage on the film made by Lorenzo Mazzetti for free cinema called Together, in which the principal actors were Michael Andrews and Eduardo Paolozzi. He also, and that's the link, he was also the cameraman on this film, Beat Girl, 1960. It was a kind of British effort to cash in on the American teen flick, like Blackboard Jungle. All the early American rock and roll films were doing very well. We started to have our own pop stars. Cliff Richard made the first, and Adam Faith the year after this film Beat Girl, which was kind of cashing in on those things. But it so happens that Free Cinema's cameraman Walter Lasserly was the cameraman on this. He's incredibly disdainful of it in his biography, in his autobiography, I might say. But since we're at the AA, of course, Shirley Ann Field there, the star, was the errant daughter of a naughty, naughty architect who was far too bound up with his plans for a utopian city to pay attention to his wayward daughter. So there. So that's what this talk was originally going to be. And I insist on doing just a few bits about brutalism. I've seen that Peter Smithson's arrived, so I don't have to say much about this. He can tell you much better than me. But really what I've said so far indicates that I don't think you can make out much... You can't make out much of a case for directly Nigel Henderson's influence on photography in the 1950s. The way in which it might be at all clear is via this, which I'm sure you all recognize as just a detail of Peter and Alison Smithson's CM grill of 1953, which of course used Nigel Henderson's photographs. In the top centre there under street, you've got Gillian Alexander skipping on what are the steps of the Henderson's house on Chisenhale Road. That's in fact where they're all done. They're all looking down their steps which shoot down onto the street. That set of images. There she is from Victoria Walsh's book on Nigel Henderson. And I'll skip through these. You all know these incredibly well, and that's the idea that was incorporated, of course, in the Smithsons' project for the Golden Lane housing project, the idea of retaining the associations of life and movement and relationships on the street in these street decks in the air. This Peter Smithson, the man who did it all, wasn't at the original talk I gave, so I can flip by. But the Rayner Banham, in a sense, just after, again, the demise of the independent group, if you take the last independent group lecture as the end of it, at the end of 1955, published an Architectural Review, in a way the first exposition of new brutalism, there it is from Architectural Review, which tried to link connections between sculpture, architecture, and painting in the Pollock that's there, and Nigel Henderson's photography. And I don't know whether this is published widely or not, but a really fascinating thing that Peter Smithson told me, and I hope he will tell us something about, is the fact that he too was at the 1948 exhibition of Peggy Guggenheim's at Venice, which included the Jackson Pollock paintings, which influenced so many British painters. So that was a very interesting piece of news to me, that one of our leading architects was also attending that in 1948. It seems to me that the focal point for what all of the people that developed what was called brutalism didn't want was epitomized in the 1951 Festival of Britain at the South Bank. Really, what they absolutely deprecated was the frilliness, the fussiness, the trivial, the ephemeral nature, as they saw it, of most of the things exhibited there, and indeed the buildings themselves. Tony Del Rencio, who was the next year to become a founder member of the independent group, said at the time in a review that he was furious at the festival's resolute rejection of an international character. And Rayner Banham wrote about the younger generation's depressing sense that the drive was going out of modern architecture. Its pure dogma was being diluted by politicians and compromisers who had lost their intellectual nerve. He too raised this analogy with angry young men, as I said earlier. However, and I won't talk about, for obvious reasons, about the work of the Smithsons, but in a sense what was visible in Britain in the 1950s is a sort of kind of mini Corbusier always to my architecturally trained eyes. I couldn't resist, since I was actually visiting someone there at the weekend. There is some béton brut, part of the name if you like, from Sterling and Gowan's scheme for Ham Common. And there's the original, part of the original block, of the first block that they built there next to the 18th century house. And these kind of horizontal bands of exposed concrete. Most of this stuff's not a million miles away from Unité d'Habitation and other things. I mean, all very interesting buildings to me, I must say. But the other thing is that in terms of the dissemination, I think Sandy Wilson's not here today. It's a shame, isn't it? But again, I'm not even, you know so well what these buildings are, and you seem to find them so amusing. You obviously know really well what they are. I shan't say, but the point about this is that the way in which one can actually see the repercussions of the independent group is always, it seems to me, through architecture, and almost never through painting, and hardly through sculpture. And it's constantly being linked with the fine arts. But to me, the way in which you can really see the course of independent group ideas and connections is not that way at all. It's almost entirely through architecture. And this is, I'd showed this slide at Sudbury again, this is from Paolozzi's first ever exhibition of sculpture, 1946. Sculpture made out of concrete. And I would posit this as the beginning of brutalism, in a sense, in that that was such a brutal thing to do in the English art scene of 1946. Oddly, this exhibition was successful. It was at the Mayor Gallery, and the proceeds enabled Paolozzi to go off to Paris, which he did for several years, where people like Nigel Henderson, Bill Turnbull would visit him. But he was the man who went off to Paris, to what was still considered the center of art at that crucial time of his life. And these are actually photographed. Most of these things don't exist. They're photographed from the famous first article in Horizon magazine that Robert Melville wrote about Paolozzi. And I think the idea of being made out of such an unprecious material as concrete is in a sense one of the essences of what brutalism was about. It was raw, it was authentic, it was a kind of strange realism. There's a real directness and tactileness about working in a material like concrete. And it was really two fingers up to the British art establishment. And if you're familiar with most sculpture of 1946, it must have been quite a radical thing to do. And so this was Paolozzi's first exhibition. Well, he of course became a member of that group of people. There they all are, an image you're very familiar with from This Is Tomorrow, 1956, which again it has to be borne in mind was an exhibition which occurred at the Whitechapel Art Gallery after the end of the independent group as such, formally, and which in a way marked the end of Nigel Henderson's close connection with anything in terms of the public visibility of his photography or his collages or other work. And in the ICA exhibition of the independent group, it seems to me that again two of the testimonies of the influence of that group that resonated most for me were those of Ron Heron and Denise Scott Brown. Now they're an axis of architecture which is different of course to brutalism, but I found it significant that the most telling people who said they actually went to see the Parallel of Life and Art exhibition, or This Is Tomorrow, and were moved by it and were influenced by it, were key architects. If you ask the painters from the Royal College, the emergent British pop painters, they'd all say, oh, we actually didn't like the paintings that were to do with the independent group. I mean, that's just the evidence. And equally, in terms of the dissemination of those ideas, here's a Paolozzi drawing from Architectural Design magazine in the mid-1950s, which I like because, well, it's dated there 1955, Men with a Camera, combines the two subjects again. Richard Hamilton's especially drawn version, the silver doesn't read very well, this was specially applied. Again, Architectural Design magazine, slightly later on in the 50s. This was Theo Crosby, if you like, a fringe member of the independent group, publishing members of the independent group at a time when you couldn't find their work in any British art magazines. I think it's really important to understand the significance of this group, to recognize they were not published in art magazines at this time. They might be now, very much retrospectively. They might have been for the last 10 years or so, but they absolutely weren't then, apart from an odd little review in the back pages of Art News and Review, which is almost not an illustrated magazine as far as this was concerned. And so in Architectural Review, and here in Architectural Design, is almost the only place you'd find the work reproduced and discussed of those artists. And that is Studio magazine, our leading art magazine, if you like, of the same time. And I think just that photograph of the title page shows you how far away that was from the independent group aesthetic and from what Architectural Design was reproducing. And that, to me, is what a British art magazine looked like at that time. And it's really no surprise that they weren't reproducing Hamilton's proto-pop Chrysler Corporation images. And that word images tells me that I haven't got onto image, which is really sad for you. And I've been shut up. Try just as well. Okay, 2 out of 3 categories you've got there. That's it, yeah?
Yeah, unless you want to say something about image.
Well, that takes ages. Well, shall I just whip through a few more slides as quickly? Well, all right, look, very, very briefly if I can. I wanted to emphasize that Nigel Henderson's side of all this, because I've pinned this thing on him still. He's the man I'm thinking about at the moment. That business of the material as found, even Banham would describe those sorts of grungy materials he was using in terms of being post-nuclear holocaust. Banham liked those sort of connections. But it was something that always seemed to me to be wedded to either the ancient past, even the aerial views that Henderson liked, that reminded him of the ones from the planes that he was navigating during the war, that sort of planned view of the Earth was sort of linking back to Britain at its most ancient, or whatever country he was over. There was always something kind of ancient and lost about it. He complained when the cigarette packs, which he liked the design of, was changed because he got attached to the old Player's cigarette pack design. There's always this slightly atavistic idea, and really is nothing to do with emergent pop. That's the point I was trying to make. That's a very different thing, and I think he was fundamentally against it. Parallel of life and art, images, images democratized, images talked of as images beyond being something separate like sculpture, photographs, whatever sort of image it was. They all became images. I heard 3 great quotes never published from Francis Bacon the other day. I mean, he said the same thing 3 times. He said Pope Innocent X he never regarded as a painting. We could talk about that in the plenary session. That's a great quote from Francis. John Volker, the forgotten man who did the installation at This Is Tomorrow with Richard Hamilton and John McHale, here doing a house from Rayner Banham's new Brutalism book, which included a John McHale photo mural. We're onto the sort of pop side of it now. John McHale's design, little collage design for Frank Cordell's absolutely final ever independent group lecture on pop music. Pop. This was Tony Del Rencio, art editing a fashion magazine, mass circulation, Woman's Own, 1954. That's a Del Rencio issue. Alloway absolutely committed to the idea that Cordell and Del Rencio were working in the real pop sphere, low culture. They both worked in low culture. Tony Del Rencio talking about shoes, hair and coffee in ARC magazine again, Royal College of Art, Fuzzy. Alan Fletcher, pioneer in the new British magazine culture, graphic designs, writing from America for the Royal College of Art magazine in 1957. Hey folks, this is America, it's groovy, they have wings on their cars, pop. And then finally the whole thing kind of comes full circle and collides in the 60s where you've got those magazine graphic men, you've got the whole thing's turned pop. Nigel Henderson is kind of not part of the picture anymore after 1961. He goes to sleep for 15 years then. Everything's changed and it all comes full circle with David Hockney, the hot new painter from the Royal College, being reproduced in an early issue of our first ever colour supplement. That's it. That's kind of image in 2 seconds. Okay.
Thank you.
I've been practicing your name.
Which?
I can't tell which is the...
It's that way around. So the writing, if you can read the writing, you're okay. I'd like the lights on, if you don't mind. The house lights. I don't need the slides straight away. How do we do it?
Adds all of it. So can you see the lights on?
I would try to not to be retrospective. The intention of every generation is to do what seems necessary. Now, within that, there can be interpreted various emotions, I suppose. You know, that is to be different from the previous generation, to take over from the previous generation insofar in the same way as the father and son relationship. And in the case of artists, to be famous. I mean, certainly the later people, like Hockney, had a will to be a famous person. But for me, to do what seems necessary is the essence of brutalism. Now, I now turn into a priest and give an example that in the 2 generations before us, Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe said, architecture begins when 2 bricks are put carefully together. But the first building he made at IIT in 43, the assistant on it, who was a Japanese, Joe Fujikawa, when I got these things. When the bricks turned up, how can I use instead of bricks? When the bricks turned up, I'm going to have to draw. Anybody got a pencil? Oh dear me. Okay. The bond was what we call Flemish bond.
If you want
What is
good
it?
eyesight in the back.
That dimension and that dimension is the same as that. And when the bricks turned up from the suppliers, the length was uneven, so that the face would not be flat. That is, the header would be behind the face. And the job architect said, "Mies, you know, what do we do?" And he said, "Split the header. That is, cut the header and bring the face out." And of course, the children in the office were trained by him. They were, you know, devastated because the ethos of, the supposed ethos of was, you know, that beauty is truth. And of course this was fabricating a lie, you know. And of course that kind of action to for the thought and the action not to fit was an anathema to the brutalist generation. I mean, if the face was not going to be smooth, that was it. You have to find the nature of the brick was that it should not be smooth, and that for our generation, the essence was to get the quality of the poorest things, and that itself was a reaction, I think. That is, that in a period of great material poverty, which lasted until the end of the 50s, really, that there was a feeling that if you couldn't get it, you had to fake it to look expensive, etc., etc. And say, well, that's if you could find the quality of the brick, was a different thing to its geometry, and it's impossible to describe the feeling. And I have the one and only slide. The one and only slide. And we're going to have the lights off now. This is 1953, I think. '59, the end of the period, where the quality of the architecture was in the asphalt. The tree was there. The wall was there. The bricks were there. And the new blockwork was there. This is a classic brutalist image. Now, brutalism was looking for the brickness of brick. And the thing that I've never I'll go back. The parallels that are made in the exhibition between literature, theatre, cinema, etc. In a sense, the information was new to me, because I'm sure that in the same way that the writers that are quoted knew nothing about architecture or Nigel Henderson, that is, everybody's operating in parallel, in the same way that it operates trans-world. That is, that one of the mysteries of architecture is that, that someone you've never heard of, in my generation, Louis Kahn, suddenly you find the drawing building that he's making in parallel, without any connection. I'm sure that happens in every generation. And to go back to the business of the parallels with the cinema, literature, etc. That you have to search, I had to search my mind as to what I was actually reading in that period. And by looking on the shelves. And of course, I was reading a very weird guy called Gwyn Thomas. And in a way, that was a discovery. The remaining novel I have on the shelves is A Frost on My Frolic, which is about children in a primary school in Wales. And we were given it by Bill Howe, who was. I'm assuming that the nature of the joke system in the book, I reread it recently. He could see a parallel between the place and the people, but without, you know how these things happen. You get given the book, you don't get given the explanation why you've been given it at the time. But that connection between place and person, and the wit of the child, the children, in relation to that, were essentially being seen as the spirit of time. So that they are Stilito, the people I can't pronounce, Stilito was certainly not read by me. And of course, what was read was, and that might be merely snobism, to Brecht and the theatre in the Operation Theatre in Berlin, which after '56, when we had the prize in the competition for the Berlin Hauptstadt, then from then onwards, an exploration of 20s in Berlin and the absorption of the Brechtian, that is, the Brechtian theatre, the dressing lady, was intent on getting the material right, and the light, stage lighting was flat down, so that you saw everything very strongly. And of course that was not a characteristic. Now this is me having read what they've written. That I can't discover the characteristics of English theatre that relate to in the sense that I believe the breadth of theatre too, but in the staging of the play. The staging was direct, brutalist, and no concealment, etc., etc., etc. So that I'm sorry, at that moment I have to introduce not a memoir, but to say that having read their book, they were not parallels that were consciously made at the time. Quite the contrary. Nobody knew what the other people were doing, and where one was picking up tremors was from a foreign theatre. I think probably that's all I have to say. Obviously, the most telling, I think, is the Mies van der Rohe story. You know, that is it's to do with the ethic, you know, not doing what you say you're doing. You know, and of course this is the operation of a kind of Protestantism, isn't it, in the end? You know, and I would have thought the movement in architecture was essentially Puritan. But it winds up with Puritanism.
Excellent.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I think it was a strange. What you're doing?
I'll ask Cheryl.
Okay, if you give us a couple of minutes, we're going to kind of rearrange things.
Well, don't stand up.
Yeah, don't go.
People will move to the table. Careful to speak to the microphone.
No, I can't hear you either.
Yeah, well, how can people hear if there was no sound with his own mind?
Sergeant, did you hear it throughout the rest of the day? Yeah. No, it was clear. Yes.
I'm giving to Peter. Janet Henderson as a contact sheet with these on, but unfortunately that's not camera sheet. That's Alison Smithson. This is in their Jeep on Stanton.
It's a pity that you didn't swear but hey.
Well, they are pretending.
Well, Peter doesn't remember where exactly at Stanton they are. I mean, neither the other people. Right, you've got to take those.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Is Victoria?
It's
Victoria
a
Walsh?
treat. That's definitely the site her.
You didn't remember who any of these geezers were, though. Never got who he was or he was.
I mean, I don't remember.
No,
I
I know,
think
but
we
you
took
didn't
some students. That's a Canadian. Oh, that's a fantastic car. Isn't that man with the cigarette? That's the car. No, it's the period. Yeah. How are you?
I'm fine, how are you?
Well, I was.
You've been in Greece, haven't you? On holiday. Where are you holidays?
It's fantastic.
Okay, well, thanks very much to all the speakers. I think it's been a very fascinating day. And I think we haven't really had questions to the speakers through the course of the day. And I think there are a series of kind of interesting connections and questions that have emerged over the course of the whole day. So I hope we can pick up on some of that at the session now. One of the things that I did want to do, I mean, Peter's kind of brief talk raised a couple of questions that I'd like to kind of ask him immediately, and maybe we could start also with some other questions from the audience. But one of the things that you spoke about briefly, Peter, when you were here a couple of weeks ago, and you were talking about patio and pavilion, was that you referred kind of obliquely to the nature of the collaboration between yourself, Nigel Henderson, Eduardo Paolozzi, and you talked about somehow a rather silent communication or conversation that existed between you in that collaboration. Now, I can't believe that that's entirely the case, and that there wasn't a kind of literal conversation that went on around that collaboration. And we've also heard mention of other kinds of meetings of various kind of forms, for instance, the walks in the East End with Nigel Henderson. And I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit more about some of those kind of meetings, or I mean, because you referred at the end of your talk to certain kind of connections with forms of practice that were running in parallel, where there wasn't a direct dialogue, but we have one very particular example, and it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about that.
I think what I said then about, I made an analogy, didn't I, between the architect makes a space in which certain things are certain modes of decoration, activities. The space itself tells some of the stories about what's going to happen, but it doesn't say to the user, you must have this kind of picture, you must walk in this sort of way, you must dress in this sort of way. It gives a kind of subfusc, if that's the word, hints as to what. certainly in Pavilion Pavilion, the notion of a path, the blockboard, the pathway round the pavilion that tells the feet of the occupiers, the pattern, and the sound between the blockboard or the hard chipboard and the surrounding, and the reflectivity of the walls. I'm sort of a bit wordless, but hints as to the pattern of occupation. By chance, I'm reading in a little book from Barcelona. There's a picture of the actual interior of the Villa Stein in 1929 or so. And of course, the hints that the architecture gave of the way of life that was implied by the building, and therefore the equipment and furniture that would come with that way of life. It wasn't like that at all. I mean, it was occupied in a classic Edwardian way. You know, that is, I'm trying to develop the theme that it was done without speech, virtually. That is, the hints and the possibilities that the architectural space offered were realized by the artists, you know, without, as we were not there, you know. I mean, this is what makes it such a pure example. The architect had no intervention in the decoration, if you call it that, in the occupation of the space. That is, the way in which it would evolve had to come from the architecture. You know. I'm sorry to be so long and so difficult, but it's probably all untrue. That is, we're talking about something 50 years ago, you know. So that as they're not here to contradict me, but what is true is the space was made. One walked away and came back and they'd occupied it. That is a statement of fact, you know. And the operation, the spatial, the space was acting on those people in such a way that they did that. But you could say we already knew the kind of artifacts that those two artists would make, you know. But you couldn't, I mean, it was unbelievable, really.
I mean, the other thing that I was interested in your talk was the reference to the relationship between the kind of interest or the poverty of the work, or the kind of literal kind of minimalist sense of the material, to a post-war culture of lack. so that a kind of poverty, in a sense, a poverty of expression is seen as a kind of appropriate response to the time.
Yeah, but you've obviously misunderstood my lecture. That is that if the brick was the only thing you could get, you had to discover what its nature was. That was the richness. That was not to repeat the sentence I used, not to fake richness, but to extract richness from what you could get. And I think that's really true. I think that's not a. Because you see, I still have that. That is. The smell of buildings. The smell of the casting of the concrete, the wood. The essence of the material is the most exciting part about building. That just made quality. Can I turn that over? Because I neglected to deal with the obverse point, and that is, how do architects behave now in a period of glut? That is, the overwhelming impact of the rebuilding of the Barcelona pavilion is that it's like a hotel swimming pool, because the hotel, new built hotel, the worldwide Hiltons, use that range of materials, travertine, marble, etc., swimming pool, planting. Therefore, there's a glut of those materials that Mies deployed in the Barcelona pavilion in a time when there wasn't anything in Germany. Germany was completely jiggered, and the money for the builder, the Barcelona pavilion, didn't come from the state. It came from a rich arms manufacturer. Suddenly, there could be an outpouring of money in a poverty-stricken, and no doubt the rest of the show at Barcelona was fake. That is falsely rich. The Mies made it really rich. What do we now do? Now you come to it, don't you? That is that. What is the response to too much? Too much marble, too much carpet, too many people, and of course, minimalism is another thing. That is it's
in your document 53, you were talking about giving these elements their sort of character back. I'm just, if you want to do it yourself, it is sort of this part where you talk about the difference between the modern movement and what you are trying to do. And I think it's sort of in the middle of the left-hand side. In the 20s it starts. I think that could be an answer.
How to retain the clarity of the fineness of the whole, to give the part their own internal disciplines and complexity. Yeah, in a way, that was for the things to retain their own internal disciplines and complexities. I think was a this is a statement written at the time, was a response to prefabrication, you know, where the elements were made to the elements didn't have their own identity. They were subsumed within the system. That is, you know, a nail and a screw and a nut were not given their own right to exist. But the thing is just to read what was written in the time, not listen to me. Because you see, you get put in the position of an art historian, don't you? You know, there's a lot of where you're trying to build a narrative, and if the narrative doesn't work well, you distort the fact. I mean, on the brutalism thing, you know, Peter Bannon, who never looked anything up, you know, 5% of everything he writes is wrong. I mean, but the narrative is wonderful. You know, the story is wonderful. And in your case, only 2% is wrong.
But it would be probably wrong to...
You were just about to tell us, what do you do now in a time when there's too much?
Yeah, well...
And you were interrupted. So could you tell us?
That's... I mean, that's... I find that what the work we're doing is brutalist in the sense of the materiality. But there's a lot of you know, well, the conventional thing to say about the work we're doing for Axel Bruckhauser's house, you know, is that you take the shell of a 40s made house and gradually exfoliate it so that the shell becomes encased in another like an animal that has the capacity to grow another shell around its core. Well, of course, that is really a very extravagant thing to do. That is, I think we're behaving badly in a way. That is, it's too... By responding to we're not making the decisions. Let me start with that. That is that if you've lived in a little house for 20 years and you get up at 5 o'clock every morning, you see it through the season, you're very conscious that you know, that aspect is where the sun comes, that prospect is enjoyable in such and such a season, and so on. Therefore, what we're responding to is saying, right, we'll maneuver the two shells so that it gives you the pleasures of the sun coming in and the view in the autumn and the way the light strikes between two buildings. I mean, I'm talking about The Economist again, you know, the way the light comes through becomes the, you know, is that brutalism? You know, that is, the light is treated as a physical thing, isn't it? You know, and the view is a physical thing. But it's become physically extravagant. But in Germany, is it better to do that than to go to Mallorca 4 times a year? And I think the answer is yes. You know.
I wonder if we could just go kind of quickly through the other speakers and maybe invite a kind of reflection on on the day. I mean, Thomas, one of the things that you didn't really comment on, particularly in your introduction this morning, but I was interested in your kind of eagerness to get Martin to say something about the issue of image. I notice in the introduction, one of the things that you try to articulate is a kind of opposition between the idea of imago and bild, or picture and image, and that somehow this argument is kind of central to your understanding of as found. Is that something you'd like to say something more about, or would you like? Are there other things that
would have been really nice if Martin would have said more about it? But I just know that parts of Rainer Bannon wrote about it in his new Brutalism manifesto, where he tries to sort of describe what the independent group means when they are talking about image. And there's a difference between image, which is a very active thing, and it's something in your head, in opposite to the picture, which is objective, which is sort of a record of something. And I think, as found, has very much something to do with this kind of looking at something. You know, it is an active part. It is sort of looking at something and seeing something else than somebody else would see. It has something to do with sort of breaking rules and breaking conventions, actually. And I think that's sort of the interesting part, or that's sort of the main part, what I'm thinking. It's interesting on that's found today, and so I wanted to get slightly into this anyway. And I don't know what Martin would have thought to say about the image. Was it something similar or not?
That's too complicated. Well, first of all, what I would say is something I might have said before, is that as found is kind of not too far, again, this idea of the interruption of the war from objet trouvé, from surrealism. And that's on a very literal level, okay, and it's not quite the level that you're addressing here, I understand. I don't know, I was talking to someone about this the other day, and I said I think it's a really worthwhile thing to think about, and rather oddly, I don't think I've got any answers. I mean, I think it's really worth discussing. I think what Francis Bacon meant, and we can't bring him back to ask him what he meant, this is, someone recorded 3 times that he talked about this in his very accurate, I'm sure, diaries, obviously when Francis was alive. And I mean, I've been studying him a lot for various reasons, and I think what he meant by it, I mean, this is again bringing in a different angle than one that necessarily might have to do with architecture, or even the idea of as found in architecture, which again, I can't, oh God, I'll just digress, shall I? I can't see, getting back to architecture, let's not do Francis Bacon for a minute, getting back to architecture, and I think I was really interested in what Peter was saying just then, and you can't, when that slide he showed, I constantly think of, which I couldn't talk about much, obviously, the Festival of Britain as a focus for things that they didn't want, and I see as found as being part of something that, all those sort of adjectives I was throwing at different contexts, but they're the same: rawness, authenticity. It's like this anti-preciousness, and something to do with the nature of materials as being a way to do that. So that's the as found, the brick as you find it, you know, that Peter was speaking about. But it's, I don't know, I'd like to ask experts from this period. I remember I knew architects in the 1960s. I got to know architects. And the word they always used as the ultimate pejorative, which I think this sort of has to do with this rawness as opposed to what they call tweeness. When did people start using the word twee? Did you ever use that?
Say that again.
Well, the whole thing. Or, when did you as an architect in the 60s, or did you use it before? Did you ever use the word twee to describe things you hated, like a use of brick that was all dressed up with frilly post-Eric Gilbert sculpture or something you would have loathed, or whatever it was? You know? Did you ever use that? Anyway, these chaps that I knew did. The chaps that I knew were Sterling, Cullinan, Kit Evans of BDP, people like that. And they always used it about things that they hated. Anyone to do with Michael Wickham, if he's known here, and his various sons and things, they used that. And it seems a good thing to oppose to rawness and as foundness in independent group and things we're talking about. So there's just the opposite that might help explain the thing. I don't know where that gets us with image. Francis Bacon, I think, meant something that, again, it was, the point is, I think, the parallel is it's slightly anti-precious in that I'm sure what he meant was, you know the story of Francis Bacon basing his screaming popes, of which there were many, on Velasquez's portrait of Pope Innocent X. And when Bacon was in Rome, he did this always from postcards and book reproductions of, obviously, especially at that date in the 1940s, very varying colour quality. And yet the odd thing was that one of the things he liked about Velasquez was the purple. I mean, what kind of purple was he getting in colour reproduction of 46? Anyway, when he finally got to Rome and had a chance to see the painting for real, he refused. He never saw it till the day he died. And I think he meant image because, you know, Bacon always took images from magazines, from Picture Post, from whatever, from books, various printed books, from Muybridge, but again, published in books, and so on. And in a way that, to me, was a parallel with what Richard Hamilton was doing, which we didn't mention, I guess, in Growth and Form, even before Parallel of Life and Art. But what was done in Parallel of Life and Art, I used always mediating an image from whatever source, architecture, sculpture, painting, whatever, through photography. And it was, I don't know, on another level, it's like saying the content's more important than the form or something. But there's that very different to what you were saying. When you talk about imago and architecture, that's a really different thing. Oh, shut up.
Maybe just, you know, if we keep moving through some of the presentations. I mean, I was sitting next to Anne Massey as she was listening to Victoria's presentation, and I think one of Anne's kind of part of your argument was that a lot of the work which was going on within that context was being made by artists, writers, filmmakers who were reflecting on their own immediate background and their own kind of immediate culture, which wasn't necessarily particularly privileged or you know, based around the certain elements of privilege within British society that maybe had formed the foundation of work immediately before the war. But then you were kind of commenting that Victoria's kind of comments on the work of Nigel Henderson and his own kind of description about the way that he felt very much apart from the East End context and saw it as a kind of, the way that he viewed the street was as through a kind of distance. And I wondered if you wanted to kind of pick up on that.
Yeah, you came along and completely overthrew my argument, so that's probably why I commented. I mean, first of all, can I say, I think listening to this whole day, as I have done, I mean, it just strikes me, we are talking about something 50 years ago, and let's not kind of try and pin it down. I mean, this was a really exciting moment, and let's use a sort of as-found aesthetic to look at this and not try and say, you know, who did what with who, when, what, you know. It doesn't really matter. I mean, you know, it's just really, really interesting ideas, a really interesting creative moment. And I think, I don't know, as an art historian, I think we're sometimes guilty of trying to nail it all down and call it something and say one thing led to another and, you know, well, so what? So I would just say that I wouldn't like to spoil. Do you know what I mean? And sort of there is a freshness there that I would hate to see spoiled. Anyway, getting back to the point, I just wonder whether Nigel Henderson, I mean, they did live there for all that time though, didn't they? And he was photographing his surroundings. So what I was contrasting it with was the surrealist idea of the objet trouvé, where that's something a bit more distant from their own reality. It's a bit more divorced, it's the other, it's the exotic. And I just wonder, really, was that the case with Nigel Henderson? I don't know.
What was it? No, you go.
Was he really? Yeah.
You were there. You tell us.
No, I mean, the point is made, I think, in about, in a way, you know, the kind of poetry of nostalgia You know, that is the East End was the streets that he photographed in. There would be, say, 10 or 12 substantial streets left. The rest of the people were in the new towns.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it was a kind of poem on a past way of life, you know. But essentially that it connects, I think, with the sense of what is real, insofar as, you know, the line that they from Walsh's book about their house was the only one. They persuaded the people mending the houses to give them a bath. You know, well, the passing in the train along the backs of those houses, you know, you see the tin bath, or in that time, hanging on the outside the kitchen window. Therefore, the business of taking a bath, you know, it was fantastically corporeal. I mean, you had to strip off in an ordinary room and fill a thing with water. You know, I mean, it was fantastically physical. You know, and that Henderson thing was catching the end of the physicalness of the 19th century. You know, it's essentially a nostalgic world. I mean, but turning that over, you know, you could say, well, when you showed, you know, the children, I mean, they're so elegant, you know. I mean, in a way that they're offering, you know, you put a little bit more food in them, they can turn the somersaults into another art form. You know, I mean, there's a weird kind of from this does this grow? You know, has to be sent to. Can you imagine? You know, ending up in Harlow. You know, I mean, where there was. The circumstances, the architecture, the means of earning a living were all very uncorporeal, you know. That is, there was a real deprivation. And Nigel thinks I don't talk about deprivation, they celebrate the end of a period. You know, and you could ask, what is a like somebody said, what should we do now? You know, what does a photographer photograph now? You know, where are we at the end of something? You know, back to our own little discipline, the people say what's fantastic about Sigurd Leverentz is that, am I going on too long?
No, Sigurd Leverentz.
Leverentz is remarkable because he always operated at the end of a period. That is the working back from my building, the flower shop in Malmo, 1949. There is 15 years of achievement of brutalist architecture before Leverentz acts. That is, becomes the and if you know, his neoclassicism, his drafting, etc. in the 30s, was at the end of the the inventive period. Therefore, when he produced his sentence, based on the many sentences that are already there, therefore, you say, what are we at the end of now that we can put that an architecture can pull together? You know, wow.
Victoria.
I suppose I just wanted to go back to Anna's point, and I'm not sure I even stressed it as much as I might have liked, but there was a fundamental, I think, distance between the Henderson family in the East End and Chisenhale Road. But equally as there was that distance in class from education and other social background, there was an enormous social class difference between Henderson and his contemporaries. And the one thing that struck me when I first started talking to Henderson's contemporaries like Richard Hamilton, Bill Turnbull, and even 2 weeks ago upstairs in the bar, you know, I mentioned Henderson's name to Mary Bannon, and the first thing she said was, well, of course, he was a cut above the rest of us, wasn't he? You know, the first comments are always about the difference in, I mean, there was not just age, but Nigel came, I mean, Richard Hamilton's first comment was, well, he was officer material, of course, compared to the rest of us. And there was, you know, this whole profile of Henderson as something completely different to the majority of people he was circulating with. And that was not only courtesy of the fact that he came from a wealthy upper middle class background with property, but he also married into Bloomsbury, and he married into Bloomsbury, you know, Virginia Woolf, being the sister of Adrian Stephen, father of Judith Stephen. You know, he went and lived in a house, he inherited the Stevens house in Landermere Quay, where the family still lives now. And, you know, when they moved down there, and Fried and Eduardo Paolozzi went and joined them, the one thing that I think Eduardo Paolozzi brought up very much in Desert Island Discs when he did it with Sue Lawley, and Frida Paolozzi is happy to recall, is the kind of snobbishness. I mean, the Hendersons were happy to invoke a class difference, you know, quite often at one level, but in the same way a contradiction. At the same time, you know, Henderson despised a lot of all the pretensions that he had to suffer. He hated being at Stowe, where he was at public school, and burnt the Union Jack very early on in order to leave it. And, you know, his mother was a maverick figure, but I think he had that kind of quintessentially English sort of fight with his class, not wanting to be it, but being essentially part of it. And I think another fact that isn't actually brought out and needs a lot more work, and we talked about it briefly, is, and Henderson's sister particularly drew my attention to it, was the fact that Judith Stephen was a Quaker, and she very much, her sort of mass observation style work was informed by that sort of do-gooder ethic. So that in itself had a kind of infectious distance. And I mean, I think there's something to be done about Quakerism in the art world at that time, which is actually quite a strong force. And we weren't sure if Dorothy Morland was one, but there were other Quaker figures at the time.
She's married into a Quaker
family. So I don't know enough about that, but I think you can't, I think there's a lot more to be written about the class differences.
I mean, one of the other things that you brought up, Victoria, was the difference between, somehow a tension between you know, Judith's and Nigel's way of the relationship between their kind of various kinds of practice, which in their own ways both recorded the same situation, but perhaps in very different ways. I mean, one of the things that we haven't really talked about much today was the you know, the issue of film and maybe film documentary. That if Judith's work represents a kind of tradition of mass observation, anthropology, sociology, whatever, that emerges before the war and has a whole tradition of filmmaking that goes along with it, you know, that contrasts with Nigel's maybe very personal, in some ways quite, you know, this kind of balance between subjectivity and objectivity that he's kind of treading in the work. And it's someone like Lindsay Anderson's documentary work, and what makes the kind of film work that's taking place within the 50s different from the kind of 1930s documentary work. I don't know if there's a kind of comment there.
You've got something to say about that, haven't you?
Yeah, if you,
you know, I've got a couple of slides in there we didn't get onto, which sort of illustrate this in a way, because if you'd been good, I was going to show you two kind of rescue 35mm pictures by Nigel. and partly that's to do with the look of the thing. You know, that if he does a landscape format, 35mm photograph, which is what he did before he ever picked up a Rolleiflex and did these things, it looks very filmic. It looks very kind of 1948, instant references to Italian neorealism or proto-Lindsay Anderson, if you want, or references back across the water, Humphrey Spender and mass observation doing photographs. And it's partly that weird thing about photography, that technical thing. He was using a Leica and a 35mm. That's what film, you know, that's what the Leica grew out of, a film camera, and sprocketed 35mm is film raw material for movie films. And it instantly has that look. And it seemed to me, I mean, there were very few of them known. And Janet Henderson had a few rolls all ripped and messed around, and he said he hated the Leica because he forgot to focus all the time. It had a rangefinder, and nearly the whole roll's entirely out of focus, apart from a few frames which aren't by luck or something, and they're kind of remarkable and look like an entirely different thing. And I just regretted that he kind of didn't continue it a bit, really. But he said, "Oh, damn this! They're all out of focus. I'll get a Rolleiflex." You know. But it's just a fluke of history or something.
As far as I got you, you asked what the difference between the documentary films in the 30s and the 50s. I don't know the names anymore, probably there are people in it, they know it, but I remember one lovely film which was called The Night Meal. I don't know. Right. And it was a fantastic film. It was very technically sort of filmed. They really wanted to, the filmmaker wanted to show you how it works, you know, sort of physically, how the system of the night meal, the night train is, who picks up the meal. And if you compare it with, for example, Lindsay Anderson film Every Day Except Christmas, then here it describes the Covent Garden market, also in a quite sort of technical way to a certain extent, but then you suddenly find workers who have a quick sleep or go to the things, go to the restaurant and have a tea and listen to the radio, and sort of these more emotional things coming into it. So it is not. It's not only. It's more subjective, and it's more emotional, I believe, than the early films in the 30s. But probably I don't know. That's what I feel. It's different, and they were talking about that as well. I don't know, Pia, do you want to say something about that?
What some of the filmmakers in the 50s found disturbing with the 30s movies was that they had kind of a socialist, educational, enlightenment bent to it, and they just wanted to get rid of this and just see, you know, they didn't want to show how the workers come from little North England, bring all their flowers, work all day, go home, are tired, you know. They want to just show, look, there it is, you know, that's what life is, look what they do, you know, how wonderful this market comes to be. Or even in Nice Time we saw today, it's not, I mean, it has some ideological cuts, you know, that probably old men staring at the pin-up girl or so. It wasn't he didn't move the camera, you know, you don't know whether the old man was actually staring at the girl, it was a cut, so it's some montage. It has some ideological implications, but it's much more just, you know, look, you know, this is the world, this is Saturday night, you know, how it spills on, you know, how there's a lot happening, there's a lot of love, and the loneliness, the sadness of the last speakers in the end. So you could say that's more poetical and it's less ideologically trim.
It's also slightly different to the Royal Mail Commission night note, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's different. Brian, do you want to say something?
What was it that was banned?
We don't know.
Was it forms? Was it the materials of life? Was it forms of life? Was it architectural forms? Was it vernacular? what was it that was found that could then be used creatively?
Do you have an answer? Sounds like you haven't answered.
Yeah.
Would anybody like to respond to Brian's comment?
Everything. Everything.
I think that
I think it's got a good answer.
the introduction to when I read the translation of the introduction, I think it deals very well with the as found notion.
Yeah. Maybe in the last few minutes we could then open up the discussion. I don't know if people have either comments or particular questions to any of the members of the panel that they'd like to ask. Yeah, sure.
Well, I'm still curious about Peter Smithson's question. If as found was an approach in a situation when we had very little, and he wants to get as much quality out of the little you had. The book as found suggests as found for our situation today is still a very good approach. But Peter Smithson says our situation today is there's too much. There's not. So his question is what is our response now? What to do now? And there's too much. So maybe this is a question to Thomas Schrekenberger. So maybe he didn't do it in his introduction. What do you think would your answer be to Peter's question?
I wonder if Peter St. John has a response to that as well. Thomas.
I don't know what I said actually. What did you say? Yeah, it has something to do, as found, I believe it's something to do with choosing choosing for yourself what you are interested in. So it is not the question what you choose, but when you have chosen the material, the subject or whatsoever, then it's starting to be very subjective about. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Sort of so it doesn't matter how many things are around. That it is sort of things. Yeah, it's a fine. Sort of.
Well, yeah, maybe if no one asks you. Because you showed this slide of the house by Herzog and de Meuron, which moved around a tree.
Right.
And then we got the slide by Peter Smithson, also with a tree.
Yeah, that was quite funny.
That was a beautiful coincidence. But
yeah, it was. Yeah.
But the Herzog and de Meuron and the Swiss architecture is much more precise than the messiness. And Messi was pointing out.
I mean, the point I wanted to do was that Herzog de Meuron decided to leave the tree. You know, I mean, it's no problem to cut the tree to build a new building, that sort of thing. I mean, it is a decision to say, okay, I found this one. And then, actually, the point I wanted to make was that if you decided to leave this tree, what can happen with it? You know, that the tree actually formed the building at the end, and I think that's sort of an interesting sort, something I'm doing it in my work. You know, sort of find something to try to do it precise around that, because it is exciting to do. It's like a labor work. You know, it's sort of really. It's very specific.
Yeah. No. It does the aspect of what I'm calling nostalgia have a part in the where, because the Henderson photographs are the end of a culture in a way. That is that you suddenly see that the way a man wears a cap is something remarkable. You know, I mean, it is an evolved work of art. You know, and no revival can bring that about. It can bring. I'm being difficult. I mean, I'm finding it difficult. But you know the way the sheep farmers dress for their sales. You know, the speech, the gesture, the way the hat fits is a complete work of art. And at the end of a period, you suddenly become, just before it breaks, you become conscious of it. You know, and I think that I'm repeating what I said earlier in a more elaborate way.
I think that's what Nigel calls formal rituals. I think that's what he identified as the formal rituals.
Formal?
Form rituals. I mean, when he went into the estate, I mean, the first thing he describes is seeing these scenes.
I'm surprised, Peter, is that you actually looked, for instance, at Henderson's photograph or at whatever was left after the wars in East End as a place which was in some way nostalgic. And I imagine perhaps from the perspective of architects who want to build modern architecture and perhaps rebuild the city, those places might have acquired some kind of nostalgic aspect early on. But certainly my feeling when, for instance, we heard so great presentation by Alain Tanner today was that, it was right bang, there was nothing nostalgic, so it seems, in the way these stories had been written. And in some way, though, in hindsight, for instance, when we saw those two films today, it's very easy to think, well, okay, that was the world of our parents and so on. But I suspect for those who were actually making those films, there was something, very contemporary, even though it may have been partly about their parents. And that is, to me, it seems quite, okay, perhaps they were showing a world which was changing, and perhaps it's inevitable, but then to look at those films and those images as being nostalgic, and to me is in conflict with those people trying to be in some ways realist, showing things as they are, or showing things as found.
I think it's a huge difference between 1950 and 1960, and Alan Sillitoe represents 1960 in that sense. You come to these things and you put it on, but it's nice to learn something. And I was really interested in what Peter said about that. He's pushing that idea of nostalgia, and I think it's the recognition of something that was about to go. And I'm Anaraki enough that I went to Chisenhall Road to take that slide that I showed last weekend. And you have a look round there and you recognise all the places. Nigel shot a lot on Roman Road, but you realise, and it really emphasises what Peter said, because apart from this little square of streets there, ringed by the canal on the north, and you've got Victoria Park, Hackney, but apart from that little oasis that Chisenhall Road was in the centre of, everything is a 60s or 70s block, and therefore was a bomb site probably when Nigel was there. So it was literally an oasis, this island of old East End surviving in the middle of, it had the shit bombed out of it all around there, basically.
It's a weird business, isn't it? Because there are two things going on in parallel. That is the recognition that I don't have to repeat what I've just said, but also the whole drive to ingest what was currently available into art. That is, the one thing that we organised for the independent group was a school friend who was a aerodynamicist, working for British Air, whatever it was, de Havilland. That is that. What were the new inputs into art? That is, there was a parallel celebration of a past which was dying, and a conscious examination of those things that are entering art which hadn't existed before. I mean, after all, the parallel of life and art was consciously saying, what is new into the, microphotography, air things, I mean, that in the 50s, the French started to air photograph the limes, the Roman circling around Syria, etc., North Africa, and that suddenly another kind of urbanism came into existence. That was the system of communications and points of support for the Roman was a completely, the size of it, the dimension of it was that, well, the parallel of life and art thing was saying all that is going to change the nature of art, that is, there's a new input, which of course there was in the 19th century, I mean, there was a huge, different vision of the, I mean, when you see still the railway stations of, the one in Budapest, Eiffel, I mean, they're here, the Victoria, you excuse the expression, the concourse is fantastic, I mean, there's a whole new input in the spatial input into architecture, which was consequence of engineering things. Well, you could say, well, that's very odd. We're talking about the as found, because the period, not so odd. That is, what was the nature of the micro photograph from the artist's point of view? The as found was operating on another range of phenomena. I mean, I think that's important. I mean, it wasn't a retrospective thing.
Okay, I read my question again. The as found thing.
Okay.
Hasn't it something to do with idea of collage, of things that have been found, that are not specially made for that particular occasion of that piece? And it's about the relationship of these found pieces. And therefore, somehow the challenge is finding about relationships. And it's not about making things so much. And translated that into the art of architecture, I think this is about the relationship of the space between these things. And how these... And I mean, that goes also into Brecht, perhaps, an architecture of representing the conditions